Hello, welcome to the Fiberglass Reinforced Plastics Institute YouTube channel. Thank you for tuning in with us for a summary of specific tank inspection regulations and compliance practices that provide insight when answering this important question. Does our FRP tank inspector comply with law? Federal above-ground storage tank inspection laws have been promulgated by both the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, and the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA. These laws have evolved since 1980, were substantially in place as of 1999, and are intended to help tank owners prevent, prepare for, and respond to chemical-related disasters. Most importantly, for the question posed here though, they mandate inspectors comply with recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices that are drawn into these laws. Over half of the states in the United States also enacted supplemental laws, which in several cases expand on federal mandates, impacting inspectors in the area of training, certification, testing protocols, and inspection intervals. Obtaining value from these laws as they apply to fiberglass tanks has been challenging for tank owners, insurance agencies, and regulators. Why? Because until introduction of the FRPI SP8310 Licensed Above Ground Storage Tank Inspector Certification Practice in 2018, there hasn't been a comprehensive industry organization practice in place to provide a means of compliance with these laws. In looking back with a constructive eye, well-intended but inadequate attempts at recommended practices are inadvertently being used. Incompetent inspectors are still allowed to practice. Well-qualified inspectors have struggled to differentiate their expertise. Tank owners have borne costly tank outcomes or been at risk for decades. Plus, insurance agencies and regulators haven't had a sound means for minimizing risk or administering compliance with laws. This long-term absence of a practice for fiberglass tanks has been problematic. A sense of complacency has set in many years back, and now we have an opportunity to effectively move our industry forward on all of these fronts in a very profound way. The following presentation is an overview of EPA, OSHA, and state agency examples of tank inspection regulations at law, plus the FRPI SP8310 inspection practice as a means of compliance with law. It will provide added insight to help you answer this question as to your inspectors complying, and a solution for compliance if they don't. Regulations at law. There are 6 federal above-ground storage tank inspection regulations to be familiar with that impact the chemical industry, including EPA's CERCLA, EPCRA, and Clean Air Acts, EPA 40 CFR 370, Hazardous Chemical Reporting Community Right to Know, EPA 40 CFR 68, Chemical Accident Prevention Provisions, plus OSHA's 29 CFR 1910-119, Process Safety Management of Highly Hazardous Chemicals. In addition, there are dozens of state agency regulations at law for which we'll provide a few examples. Now let's look at the EPA Acts, creating a foundation for chemical above-ground storage tank regulations. Then, drill down in each regulation at law to the chapters and verses by number where these laws drive inspector requirements, creating value for all those involved in fiberglass tank inspection. In 1980, EPA enacted the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation and Liability Act, known as CERCLA, or the Superfund. It focuses on cleanup of hazardous waste, accidents, spills, and other releases. In 1986, the Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act was enacted, known as EPCRA. It focuses on helping communities plan for chemical emergencies, including reporting for storage, use, and release of hazardous substances. In 1987, EPCRA led to the EPA 40 CFR 370 Hazardous Chemical Reporting Community Right to Know regulation. In 1990, the Clean Air Act Section 112R Rule Amendment was enacted. It applies to facilities with regulated extremely hazardous substances and requires these facilities to develop and implement a risk management program to prevent accidental releases. In 1999, the EPA Section 112R rule led to the EPA 40 CFR 68 Chemical Accident Prevention Provisions regulation. As you can see from the evolution of these acts, first in the 1980s we cleaned up our mess, became accountable for consequences, and got a system in place for defining future messes. And then, in the 1990s, we put a rule in place to hopefully prevent a mess from happening in the first place. From these acts over the decades has come a consolidated list of chemicals subject to these regulations. It is referred to as the EPA list of lists, wherein Appendix A includes over 1,500 regulated chemicals that tank owners must mind responsibly. EPA 40 CFR 370 establishes reporting requirements under two categories for threshold quantities of regulated chemicals. Extremely hazardous substances at quantities greater than or equal to 500 pounds, or approximately 55 gallons per tank, and non-extremely hazardous substances at quantities greater than or equal to 10,000 pounds, or approximately 1,000 gallons per tank. All affected chemical storage facilities in the United States are required by federal and state government to register these regulated substances and report discharges that may occur. EPA 40 CFR 68 establishes requirements under Subpart A, Section 6812A, for risk management planning, plus Subpart D, Section 6873, mechanical integrity, that pertains to the inspection and testing of tanks storing chemicals listed under Subpart F, Section 68130, for regulated toxic substances. This list is limited to 77 chemicals, where substances are defined as those that are pure or in mixtures of 1% concentration. Subpart D, Prevention Program, is where industry organization inspection and testing practices are drawn into law. Specific language here includes Section 6865D2, the owner or operator shall document that equipment complies with recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices. Section 6873D2, inspection and testing procedures, shall follow recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices. Plus, Section 6873D3, the frequency of inspections and tests of process equipment shall be consistent with applicable manufacturer's recommendations and good engineering practices. EPA has 10 regional offices across the United States, managing territories as illustrated here, that enforce compliance with these regulations. In 1992, OSHA enacted the 29 CFR 1910-119 Process Safety Management of Highly Hazardous Chemicals regulation, where EPA has aligned 40 CFR 68 language nearly word for word with this regulation. OSHA 29 CFR 1910-119 establishes several requirements under Subpart H that pertains to the inspection and testing of tanks storing chemicals listed under Section 1910-119A11, Appendix A, for regulated toxic and reactive highly hazardous chemicals. This list is limited to 137 chemicals, where substances are defined following EPA definitions as those that are pure or in mixtures above 1% concentration. Chemicals listed include most of, but notably exceed the number on the EPA 40 CFR 68130 list. Subsection 1910-119D, Process Safety Information, and 1910-119J, Mechanical Integrity, is where industry organization inspection and testing practices are drawn into law. Specific language here includes Section 1910-119D32, employers shall document equipment complies with recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices. Section 1910-119J42, inspection and testing procedures shall follow recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices, plus Section 1910-119J43, frequency of inspections and tests of process equipment shall be consistent with applicable manufacturer's recommendations and good engineering practices. In 2016, OSHA published significant standard interpretations for the phrase recognized and generally accepted good engineering practices, or RAGAGEP, as it pertains to understanding how to comply with both OSHA and EPA regulations we just reviewed. This memorandum of interpretation was provided to OSHA regional administrators for their use in enforcing these laws. Here's a snippet from the memorandum, wherein it specifically speaks to interpretation of the RAGAGEP verses by number. And here's another snippet showing 4 examples of acceptable RAGAGEP. The first being widely adopted codes as adopted by federal, state, or municipal jurisdictions. The second, consensus documents, as vetted by third parties such as American National Standards Institute and similar requirements. The third being non-consensus documents such as industry organizations develop. And fourth, internal standards as employers who own tanks may develop. This interpretation goes on to say that these internally developed employer standards shall still represent regulator and industry organization-based RAGAGEP. So, if a code, industry consensus standard, or recommended practice exists, then it shall be followed. What's not regarded as RAGAGEP, though, are withdrawn codes, standards, or practices, plus publications made available by parties other than regulators and bona fide industry organizations. OSHA has 10 regional offices across the United States, managing territories as illustrated here, that enforce compliance with these regulations, which also mirrors EPA territories. Okay, let's look at some state agency examples of above-ground chemical bulk storage tank regulations now. Since about 1999, over 24 state agencies in the United States have enacted regulations, with many more in process. FRPI is in possession of regulations at law for states illustrated here in orange. Here are 4 examples of these laws that are administered by the Massachusetts Fire Marshal, New York Department of Environmental Conservation, New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, and Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. These laws regulate inspection of tanks ranging in size from 185 to well over 10,000 gallons in capacity, plus typically require daily, annual, and 5-year inspection intervals. Some states expand on federal mandates as mentioned earlier, where, for example, New Jersey DEP requires acoustic emission testing every 5 years, and Pennsylvania DEP requires their own inspector training and certification, whereas other states expand on and echo federal mandates for the scope of inspector qualifications. As an example, New York DEC expands requirements under Part 597, Section 597.3, Table 1 shown here, invoking a list of over 1,400 regulated hazardous substances as compared to EPA's 77 toxic substances and OSHA's 137 toxic and reactive highly hazardous chemicals. Whereas New York DEC echoes requirements under Part 598, Section 598.7c, above-ground tank systems, 5-year inspections, subsection 598.7c1, including language that specifically states that the owner or operator must inspect all above-ground tanks, consistent with a consensus code, standard, or practice that is developed by a nationally recognized association or independent testing laboratory. New York DEC has 9 regional offices across the state, managing territories as illustrated here, that enforce compliance with these regulations. Compliance with law. Laws mandate inspectors shall follow RAGAGEP for frequency of inspections and tests, inspection and testing procedures, plus documenting equipment complies with such practices. OSHA has determined acceptable forms of RAGAGEP include industry organization non-consensus and consensus documents, plus widely adopted federal, state, and municipal codes. EPA and several state agencies work to mirror these OSHA mandates. In 2018, FRPI published the first comprehensive industry organization RAGAGEP as a method to support improved asset management decisions and compliance with these laws pertaining to inspection of fiberglass above-ground storage tanks. This practice is governed by SP8310, Licensed Above-Ground Storage Tank Inspector Certification, which is housed in the manual shown here, along with other companion practices. SP8310 includes procedures for developing an inspection and test plan, integrity and leak testing, determining remaining useful life, suitability for continued service and next inspection interval, reports, record keeping, inspector education and credentialing, plus practice administration. Third-party accreditation of SP8310 is in process now, where the United States Patent and Trademark Office is anticipated to approve a registered certification mark for FRPI licensing to inspectors in second quarter 2020. FRPI is also currently working towards achieving American National Standards Institute, or ANSI, accreditation under the ISO IEC 17024 International Standard pertaining to conformity assessment associated with general requirements for bodies operating certification of persons. These accreditations will each independently advance SP8310 from a Type 3 to a Type 2 RAGAGEP per federal regulations, where type is not intended to reflect a hierarchy in law. There you have it. These are the regulations at law for above-ground storage tank inspection. FRPI 8310 is a recognized and generally accepted good engineering practice drawn into each of these laws. And one last note on laws. In response to a 2015 lawsuit filed by a coalition of special interest groups alleging EPA did not issue regulations as mandated by Congress in 1972 to prevent and contain toxic chemical discharges, the EPA conducted an incident investigation and announced a final ruling in the U.S. Federal Register on December 19, 2019. They concluded a better approach to reducing the risk of accidental releases of hazardous chemicals is to improve the performance of regulated facilities by achieving greater compliance under Regulation 40 CFR 68, instead of imposing additional regulatory requirements. Therefore, it's a good time to be sure your FRP tank inspector is in compliance with a regulator or bona fide industry organization RAGAGEP, and, when required by the RAGAGEP, they are properly credentialed to make critical determinations such as suitability for continued service and next inspection interval. So, with this insight now, what is your answer to the question, does our FRP tank inspector comply with law? If the inspector is a certified FRPI 8310 inspector, certifying their inspection in accordance with SP 8310 practices as evidenced by the FRPI certified mark they apply on their report, then the answer is clearly yes. If the inspector has simply been performing inspections based on their proprietary approach, an unofficial inadequate guidance document, or a tank owner internal standard as the RAGAGEP, then they probably are not in compliance with the law today. Why? Because as pointed out earlier in this review of laws and compliance mechanisms, until the introduction of FRPI SP8310 in 2018, there hasn't been a comprehensive industry organization practice in place to provide a means of compliance with law. Should claims of compliance be made otherwise, be sure to thoroughly investigate and compare the process SP8310 facilitates versus any other RAGAGEP claimed to be followed. The differences will be obvious and substantial. FRPI 8310 inspectors are rigorously third-party qualified to utilize a vetted, thorough, state-of-the-art, technology-based industry organization best practice that helps tank owners manage reliability, risk, and compliance with the laws. If you haven't already, then please employ, become, or require a certified FRPI 8310 inspector. Thank you again for your interest in tuning in with us. Please watch these other YouTube mini on-demand webinars popping up here momentarily, and take the next steps to engage this long overdue, exciting fiberglass tank inspector opportunity.